Hey there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast. We're exploring layers of the human heart underneath our belief statements. I'm Brian Fisher.
And I'm Tim Boswell.
And Tim is back in the house. Dr. Tim Boswell. You're the only accredited person on this show, so I feel like every time we introduce you, we should make sure to note you're a doctor of something.
I don't know that you have to every time, but I'll take it.
It gives us credibility. I mean, we're also, Kyle and I, going to get it. Kyle is off this week at spring break here in Texas, at least this part of Texas. So he and his family are in Washington, D.C. So they took their whole family up there to see the apple blossoms and all the monuments and all that. So he'll be back with us soon. But my guess is he would have preferred to have dialed in there if he could have, because Kyle hates to miss any episode of the podcast, but that's where he is today. We bring you greetings. I'm in Fish Tank Studios outside of Dallas. Dr. Boswell is on the other side of the Metroplex. If you don't know much about Texas, the Dallas area has over the years morphed into Fort Worth, and the whole complex is now just called the Metroplex. It's like one massive city. It's like 7 million people now, something like that.
It's huge. Too big.
It's huge. Anyway, Kyle and I are on one half of the Metroplex. We're sort of on the eastern side. Tim and his family live over
West Coast.
There's no coast. We are
right.
On the other side of the Metroplex in Fort Worth. So now that we've moved to video, Tim no longer has to drive an hour and 20 minutes to get over here to the Dallas area. Instead, can just hang out from Fort Worth. And now we get to see your beautiful face, your amazing goatee, your facial hair, such as it is.
I was going to do thumbs up a moment ago, but then I remembered what happened to you and Kyle last time, so I don't know if I should go that.
Kyle and I keep setting off visual settings in the software, not knowing how to stop them. So if you're listening to this on audio, we will stop making video references. But if you are interested in video podcasting, you can now catch the podcast on Spotify video, and we are uploading all of our video recordings to YouTube. It's a small channel right now, but you can check that out at Soil and Roots on YouTube if you want to watch us. And you can catch the video episodes on the website as well. So if you go to the soilandroots.org website and just click on podcast, the last 4 episodes have the video just embedded, and you can watch it there. If you prefer to listen to us, which is my preference, you can still listen wherever you are. Tim and I are doing the greenhouse episodes. So if you're new to the Soil and Roots community, this is a deep, different journey. This is not a Bible study. It's not Christian events or current events. We're not trying to parse things in the news from a Christian worldview. That there's great content out there. We are, for the last 2 years, have been exploring what we call deep discipleship. Deep discipleship is sort of the deep end of the faith that, quite honestly, we don't always have much exposure to. We deal with different pieces of what does it mean to become more like Jesus than what you might have experienced in other places. So we're just about ready to wrap up our second year. So we're 8 episodes in, and the podcast is laid out in a specific order. It starts with season 1, ironically, episode 1, and we're now in season 4. And we're taking certain pieces of our spiritual journey and we're picking them apart. And somewhere around episode 40, I got really tired of listening to myself talk every episode, so I invited Kyle and Tim to join as co-hosts. So every other episode, we do what's called a greenhouse episode. And a greenhouse, if you go to the website, is a small community that we help to form and support to cultivate deep discipleship, to explore the richer soils of the faith and of our stories and of our purpose and of what community actually means. And that's what we try to mimic here on the greenhouse episodes. So every other episode calls back to the previous episode, and we look to break it down. So oftentimes it's just Kyle, and sometimes it's Kyle and Tim. Is this your first time with just you and me doing the episode?
I believe it is, yep. It's always been us and Kyle.
Well, this is going to be different because I tease Kyle all the time because Kyle's, an emotional actor, right? He wears his emotions on his sleeve. He's very encouraging, highly empathetic. And you and I tend to be more nerdy, pick things apart.
Speak for yourself.
Level. No, I'm speaking for you. I think that's fair.
All right,
that's fair. We've known each other for 10 years. I think I can call you a nerd.
So I'm a little worried that now all of your teasing is going to be directed at me, unless it's going to be even doubled down on Kyle since he's not here to defend himself. I mean, that's another possibility.
Yeah, I got in trouble for my sarcasm with him, so I've tried to tone it down. I'm not sure everybody understands that that's done in love, even though it's one of my love languages. Anyhow, so Tim, I think this is the first time you and I have done it without Kyle. That's great. It'll be a good experience. I'm sure he'll pick us apart when he listens to it.
Oh, sure.
So we are talking about the previous episode. The previous episode was about Inside Out. We're doing this little mini-series on what's called Kingdom Dwellers. So we're in season 4. It's all about the forgotten kingdom. We maintain that the kingdom of God is the primary theme of the New Testament, and yet, if you were to line up most Christians and ask them to define it, they'd struggle to define what the kingdom is or what the gospel of the kingdom is. It's just not part of our Christian ethos much today, and it hasn't been for a few hundred years. And I think that's to the detriment of our faith and of our spiritual journey. So we're in this little mini-series of season 4 called Kingdom Dwellers. What we're doing is we're picking out some qualities of Jesus and the early disciples that we may not think to explore in our very good traditional church settings. So we look at the Beatitudes, we look at the spiritual gifts, the fruits of the Spirit. Those are all, very upfront in Scripture. But there are characteristics of Jesus and of the disciples that take a little bit of reading between the lines. They take a little bit of observation, watching him, seeing how he interacts with people, seeing how the early apostles ministered and served and how they related to people. And so we've tried to, as we typically do, dig underneath the surface a little bit and come up with some characteristics of a deep disciple that we would aspire to, but that aren't kind of right on the surface when we read our Bibles. So we've talked about courageous curiosity. A deep disciple is inherently deeply curious about the hearts of people. We've talked about particularity. Deep disciples understand the role and importance of the individual and of paying attention, not just to somebody's words, but to their hearts. And we've discussed 4 or 5 others. We have 2 left after today's show that we're going to explore, and then we're going to move on to some other parts of the kingdom. But this episode is greenhousing the previous episode, which is all about the reality of transformation happening from the inside out. Now, we've talked about this a lot, Doc, in terms of the human heart, the individual. What we haven't really spent a lot of time on is systems. And when I say systems, political parties, church structures, denominations, families, even systems of thought. There are idea systems. So a system is basically more than one individual or a structure that affects more than one individual. And so we started to dance around, exploring how systems are transformed. Because my perception is, you might disagree, but we sort of live in the age where we're all critics, we're all social media experts. We all have abundant opportunity to express our opinions, whether they're valid or not. And systems tend to be targets of our criticism, whether they be our churches, our denominations, our neighborhoods, our communities, our HOA, our political parties, whatever. And my concern is that we often tackle the systems without, frankly, serving the much more, I think, difficult cause, which is the needs and the hearts of the individual. So that's sort of the premise of last episode. What say you? Do you fundamentally agree with that, or did you walk away saying, no, I think it's fine to spend a lot of time on the systems itself?
I think, as with many of the things we're discussing, it's a thorny, complicated question that you could come at from a number of different angles. So I do inherently agree with you that we oftentimes tend to target the system and even think of it as kind of this amorphous, nebulous structure without a face. If we spend an hour on the phone trying to reach our insurance company because they are refusing to cover something, we might shake our fist and rail against the system about the entire bureaucratic, red tape, monolithic organization that we're having to struggle against because it doesn't have a face, it doesn't have a name. We might wait for an hour trying to even speak to another human being. And so I think in this increasingly alienated, disconnected, automatized, robotic society we're living in, where it's harder and harder to have human contact and even the most basic of interactions, which are now more likely to be governed by technology, it's easy for these huge systems to be lumped into this category of almost the non-human, almost an entity without personal depth to it, and to forget that actually, in reality, all systems are made up of people. Whether you're talking about a school system, a government, or any other kind, how these decisions are actually made is in boardroom meetings and at the ballot box, at PTA meetings, at whatever it might be. Those interactions together create this system of thought or structure or governance. And so I think it's very useful to think of them in terms of individuals as well. And that really connects to what we're thinking about as far as the transformation of the human heart being changed from the inside out, realizing that we have these ideas in the air and ideas in the soil and all big things we can talk about at more depth. But in response to your question, I do inherently agree that it is a useful way to look at this, particularly in the age that we are in, where it is so easy to think of systems as being something so different from individuals, when in reality they are part of a continuum and they intrinsically interact with each other.
Yeah, to some degree, I think what I'm arguing is systems are a byproduct of the collective ideas of a group of people's hearts.
And that's not the way we normally think of it at all.
Yeah, so your insurance company is an interesting example, because when you're sitting on hold for an hour listening to music and the same voicemail repeated over and over and over again, that system is communicating something about you as an individual. Right?
And it's not positive.
It's not. No, it's not positive. I had this experience. I won't name the organization, but we're part of a Christian health care sharing program, and you'd love to say, well, it's Christian, so that means that they're going to treat the individual with extraordinary care, and their technology is going to be top notch, and they've kind of got everything worked out. You know, my average wait time when I call them is somewhere between 35 and 52 minutes to get to a human being. One of the last times I called them, the first human being couldn't help me because they weren't trained properly, and then they put me on hold for another 52 minutes. So my experience with a Christian system was no different than if I was calling a quote-unquote secular system regarding healthcare. My point is, though, whether or not it's a Christian organization or some other organization, their ideas are communicated to us, to the people they claim to serve, through the most minute details or through their entry-level protocols, whatever. And those things impact us. Now, the question is, how would we as individuals impact those systems? Like, how do you get a major insurance company to hire the necessary staff or to develop new ways of serving the individual to where the individual doesn't feel, frankly, like they aren't an individual? Those are the types of questions that I think bubble up when we start thinking about how social transformation occurs. Now, I think there's two schools of thought here in modern Christianity. The one is that we've talked about this before, the Christian fatalist. The Christian fatalist, depending on their bent, is going to say it doesn't matter. The systems are all going to become corrupted. The systems are broken, and the demise of our political parties, our country, our healthcare systems, it's inevitable because the world's going to hell. There's nothing we can do about it. And there's different varieties of Christian fatalists. You have those that think that that's going to happen imminently, and you have those that don't know or think it's down the road of peace. So those fatalists that think it's down the road of peace might be more engaged in system transformation. Those that are sure that the prophets on YouTube are right and that the world's demise is just around the corner are going to probably not bother and just sort of shrug and say, what would be the point? Why would I spend time and energy attempting to reform systems that are inevitably broken anyhow? Then you have another group of followers of Jesus who are not fatalists, and I think those can be broken down into a few groups too, but some of them are very passionate about reforming systems and parties and families and structures and governments. And you have others that sort of take the let's preach the gospel and get everybody saved, and maybe that'll have an impact sort of group. So I'm sure there are more subgroups than that. But I find it and you can pick up on this in a fairly brief conversations with most Christians about sort of where they are in terms of whether or not systems should be reformed. When I look at Jesus, and I look at the staggering, I should really take the time to list them all, but if you were to go through the Gospels and list all of the different ideas that he confronts, that I think touch every aspect of life and society, and how over time his ideas have revolutionized and transformed untold number of systems. Not that many of them have, reversed themselves. I'm not claiming that, but he has had a worldwide impact. Seems to me as if we should be functioning from the inside out. That if we want to see social system transformation, deep discipleship is the not the only, but a necessary piece of that puzzle. Does that make sense?
It does. He was unquestionably attacking and undermining idea systems that had developed over thousands of years and that are still common today. Those, as you've talked about, ideas of darkness versus ideas of light. And it's where it gets really interesting to me is where that overlaps with larger systems of thought that they had in their day, related to government, related to politics, related to the interaction between people. You touched on slavery last time. All of these systems were in place, and then we also have this. We might almost call it an overarching system of light versus darkness, and those ideas that either bend towards the kingdom or either bend against it are all mixed up in these other systems that humans have created, that humans have produced and have perpetuated over time. And so we almost see this dual layer where Christ is at once teaching from a perspective of pure truth, because he can cut to the quick and see in these systems of human creation how ideas of light and how ideas of darkness are flourishing or not. And then we have this secondary layer where he is engaging with questions where they ask him things like, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? And they're trying to trip him up. They're trying to catch him on a legality or a technicality. And Christ is at once operating in both registers. And I think that's just fascinating.
Yeah, slavery is an interesting example because the Bible is fairly routinely criticized for not outright condemning slavery. In fact, it seems to acknowledge it and try to fit itself in it sometimes. I think the argument that I'm making is perhaps we don't see Jesus and the early disciples, full frontal assault on slavery or oppressive governments or systems of devaluation of women and children. But you certainly see them, without question, dismantling the underlying ideas on which those systems are built.
Undoubtedly.
And that to me is a crucial point. So, when you fast forward to the 1980s and you look at the moral majority politically and what that was attempting to accomplish, and I think most historians think that had some success, but some colossal failures. I'm not sure it did a great job of actually articulating the underlying ideas that it was attempting to confront. It talked about the political solutions, it talked about the importance of morality, but what are the underlying ideas and underpinnings of that morality? So when you look at slavery in the New Testament, you have Christ insisting that we're made in the image of God. You have him continually elevating women and children, both through his words and his actions. I mean, he is confronting and dismantling the accepted ideas of the air everywhere. And it would take several hundred years in that culture, but many of the systems that were harmful and destructive did in fact disappear because the underlying ideas were challenged and slowly dismantled. And that's where I think deep discipleship could spend more time I'm not arguing for working on the systems themselves, but I don't think that can be done without actually dismantling the underlying harmful ideas on which those systems are built. Slavery, for example, is built on the idea that there are classes of human beings that are worthless, right? The degradation of women, what the Me Too movement is attempting to thwart, is based on the underlying idea that women are worth less than men. I've remarked on this before. The irony of the Me Too movement is it wants to insist that women are valuable, but in many corners still trumpets seeing women used as sexual objects and promotes that. Well, you can't have those. You're presenting two fundamentally different ideas attempting to dismantle the system. Ultimately, it won't work. You cannot establish true equality for women unless you also tackle the idea of their objectification. You can't have it both ways. And so that's why I think movements like the Me Too movement don't have the legs to be able to stand versus, MLK, whose ideas of ending racism and equality were solidly built and explored and explained. And I think that actually describes why in many cases these movements that are harmful, some of them are dismantled and replaced by healthy systems and some of them aren't. And I would argue usually it's because the ones that are truly reformed have made their case time and time again for why the underlying ideas need to be reformed.
Absolutely. And so long as you do only, as you mentioned with the moral majority, as you try to legislate morality, all you can really do is regulate behavior. There has to be, and many times that's worthwhile. We want to have consequences for criminal activities. We want to have regulations in place that promote safety and health and flourishing. But unless the ideas that are driving what is attacking those things are addressed, true progress is going to be temporary at best. So Christ, I think, was not, as you said, was not going full frontal assault against these different systems of his day, because any change would have been temporary, whereas undermining these idea systems and putting a new idea system in its place that could grow and spread and strengthen over time as the church grows and expands and strengthens, that lasts forever. That will never be done away with. I came across an interesting quote from, you mentioned Martin Luther King. This is perfect. He gave an address at Western Michigan University in December 18th, 1963. And I'll just read a little bit from it here because I think it kind of illustrates this dual layer that we're talking about, the difference between the two approaches and how both are worthwhile, but one is inherently going to be temporary. So he wrote, quote, "Now the other myth that gets around is the idea that legislation cannot really solve the problem and that it has no great role to play in this period of social change, because you've got to change the heart and you can't change the heart through legislation. You can't legislate morals. The job must be done through education and religion." Well, there's half-truth involved here. Certainly, if the problem is to be solved, then in the final sense, hearts must be changed. Religion and education must play a great role in changing the heart. But we must go on to say that while it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. End quote. So I think King recognized that there is benefit in working for social change and looking at the systems that we have in place within our current present moment. How can we try to have ways to restrain the heartless? How can we protect those who need protecting? And at the same time, unless the heart is changed, that hate is still going to be there. That devaluation is still going to be there. Those idea systems that say one person is worth less than another are going to continue. All you're really going to do is be restraining a certain kind of behavior in your society, which is also worthwhile, but you have to have a change in the heart to have any kind of permanent transformation.
Yeah, I resonate with that. Let's back up just a bit. When we talk about deep discipleship here on the podcast and at Soul and Roots, we've looked at it from three different perspectives, and I'm going to remind us of this again in the next episode. So we've looked at deep discipleship in three ways. One is through the eyes of Dallas Willard, who said we're living in the time of a great omission. So we talk about making disciples, but we're not actually making disciples. We might be making converts. That's good. But in terms of character forming, in terms of our church institutions being primarily about the formation of character of the individual, becoming more and more like Jesus, he said he had seen very little evidence of any program, intention, structure at all where the institutional church was doing that. So we call deep discipleship the solution to the Great Omission. It's that journey to become more like Jesus, not just to know about him, but to actually love like he loves. That's one way. The second way we talked about is through the Critical Journey, the book that we've talked about, written in the 80s, that theorized that the spiritual journey can be described in 6 stages. However, in modern Christianity, we're only experiencing the first 3. So deep discipleship is the second 3, the second half of those, the journey inward, the journey outward, a life of love. That's a second way to describe deep discipleship. The third way, which is the way we started the podcast, is through this realm of ideas. And this is, to me, the most difficult to kind of get our arms around. When we talk about the presence of these ideas that sit at the bottom of our hearts, underneath our belief systems, many times, that we actually operate from unconscious assumptions, unconscious conclusions that have been formed there by our stories, by our families of origin, by our early life experiences primarily, and that the exploration of those ideas, where they do and do not resonate with our beliefs, is the stuff of a deep disciple. That's where certainly me and others, we begin to get a little bit like, what are we talking about? I don't see ideas in the Bible. I don't hear this in Sunday school. I thought the core of my Christian faith is my belief system. And we've talked about this several times. The reality is that oftentimes we operate from ideas that do not align with our beliefs. Our thought patterns do not always align with our beliefs. And the deep disciple is somebody who spends a lot of time exploring those underpinnings of why we operate the way we operate. We call them ideas. And that can be done at the heart level, but it can also be done at the systems level. Meaning, not just exploring what systems promote, not just what my healthcare company prints in its materials, but by observing what ideas they actually operate from, which is evaluating them holistically. So what I'm resonating with is when you look at a Wilberforce, Martin Luther King Jr., Frederick Douglass, Hannah More, Mother Teresa, and these are just some of the greatest social change agents that many people are familiar with. They certainly worked on the system, but they continued, either through words and actions or both, attacking relentlessly the underpinning ideas in which the systems were built. Mother Teresa, as eloquent as a speaker as she was, I think her worldwide impact was partially accomplished through the fact that she lived out the biblical idea of human value in a population that nobody else cared about. Meaning she showed that the dregs of society had the same value that you and I have by the fact that she gave her life to them and spent years and decades of her life serving a people group that others weren't. And through her behavior, others are educated, transformed, because she was unveiling dark ideas and replacing them with light ideas. Does that make sense?
It certainly makes sense. And I think, too, if we want to dig further into that same example of Mother Teresa, her actions and her underlying ideas were in perfect alignment. And I think that gave so much strength and credibility. Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, Christ is our ultimate example. As you've pointed out many times, his every word, his every expressed thought, his every action was in perfect alignment with the idea systems that he not only understood, but embodied. He was ideas of light.
Right.
And so that should be our eventual end goal, that perfection we can never reach, but that we strive toward, to have our idea systems in alignment with God's idea systems of light, but also in a way that is then expressed through our actions. So we can see that disconnect, I think, all the time in our lives, where our actions don't match with our either expressed beliefs or with the underlying ideas. And to even begin to get our heads around getting that kind of integration to occur, as you said, we have to unearth those ideas and figure out what ideas we're actually even operating from to begin with.
Yeah, that's a key point. I think because perhaps the reason that we lionize the Wilberforces, the Moores, the Teresas, the Frederick Douglasses is because there was so much consistency between the ideas that they were espousing and their behaviors related to those ideas that we just find it to be utterly inspiring. And yet, Jesus being the final inspiration, right, manifested his ideas and died for the human race. I think there's something there that deep disciples should be exploring, even in our own hearts. Is my passion for ideas of light, whether it be something related to justice or human value or love or overcoming evil, is it so manifest in me that others around me would say, there goes an utterly consistent person. They are living out to the nth degree. We're in the middle of a huge thunderstorm here. It's even coming into the studio. So if you hear thunder, it's only because I keep, it's because it's booming outside. Anyway, there's such utter consistency in between Mother Teresa's belief that every human being is made in the image of God and how she gave her life to that cause, that she had a worldwide platform. And maybe that's where I have to look at my own heart and say, again, where is there disconnection? Where is there an idea that I feel so strongly about, but it's not really coming out in my 8 indicators, in my thoughts, in my emotions, in my behaviors, in the way I relate to people, in the way I spend my time, my money. I mean, Wilberforce, who is responsible for making slavery illegal in England, gave up most of his enormous wealth over his lifetime in that fight. You talk about a guy who put his money where his mouth is.
Yeah.
I mean, he invested to the tune of what today would be millions and millions of dollars to rescue men, women, and children from a practice he found abhorrent.
And his position,
and I think it's
credibility.
Yeah, his political position. Yeah, all that stuff. And maybe we're just so soft or we're comfortable. I don't know, but I left that episode wondering, like, why are those groups of individuals so well known in history, or should be so well known in history, but why isn't it more normal? Why aren't people like that standard? And I'm not saying that we're not doing great things for the kingdom, and not everybody is going to grace the pages of history. That's not my point. What I'm saying is, I think you're making an excellent observation, which is there's utter consistency between the ideas that they held, the ideas they were confronting, and the way that they live their lives. Is that true in my life? Should it be more true in the life of the modern day Christian? They're tough questions.
Yeah, they are tough questions. I think there's all different angles that we could come at this from. One thing that comes to me now that we've spoken about many times before on the podcast is this fragmentation that we tend to see in modern life here in the 21st century, where we might think about our church life and our work life and our family life and with friends and how we engage with politics and all these different things. And so there tends to be this idea of separating maybe discipleship from fruit, from action, from works, or seeing service as something that we do for the church, or seeing ourselves as focusing on one separate sphere of life and these others being separated. And if you look at it from that angle, then you might come to think that your faith is more of a private faith. It's between you and God, and you're focusing on yourself and your connection to Him. Oh, and then also you need to do your Christian duty by sending money to this charity and helping the homeless when you see them, or whatever it might be. And we miss this understanding that the deep disciple, I'm not there yet, but the deep disciple, all of those things are combined in following Christ. Like, it's not you have this one goal to chase after Christ and then all these other things that you do while you're not doing that. You are focused on Jesus, you're walking deeply with Him, and all of these other things flow out of that. It impacts how you speak to your wife. It impacts how you vote for candidates. It impacts how you do your job. All of these things are part of that. It's all cohesive. It's all integrated. It's all intertwined. And so if that were the case, then you would see this great consistency because it all goes back to the same source, which is a foundation in the ideas of light as represented in Christ. And so long as we continue to segment our lives and think that one part is kept over here, another part is kept over there, we're going to inherently prevent ourselves from really diving into that and operating out of that wellspring coming up, or that foundational piece, to switch to a different metaphor, that we are building everything on. So we've got to see ourselves as you said many times, integrated beings in an integrated world. No sacred and secular, it all belongs to God. Everything we do is part of our action as a disciple, and it all should be consistently founded upon that deep walk with Christ.
The reality is that whether we think the world is winding down or up, or we don't know or don't care, the invitation is the same. Love the Lord your God with everything you have and love your neighbor as yourself. And I think that inherent in that is an invitation to look at both individual hearts and confront those ideas and the ideas that drive the systems in which we live and operate, and to, as Christians, say, am I a part of a system, or am I endorsing a system that is actually unloving to my neighbor, and how do I respond to that? I think that's the question I walked away from last episode and this episode. And a deep disciple, somebody who is centered their life around becoming like Jesus, I think that's a regular practice, and it sounds like that's exactly what you're doing. It's exciting. So thanks for hanging out with me for a few minutes here today, Doc. I know you got a busy family, and they're kind to leave you alone for an hour to spend the time with me.
Thanks for having me. Sounds like maybe the storm passed through over there.
Yeah, it's great to be surrounded by electrical equipment when there's a lightning storm going on outside.
Right?
That makes a ton of sense. And my ideas of my own temporal existence may need some adaptation. That was a long way of saying I could be struck by a lightning bolt like anybody else. I might want to be smarter about when I push record.
Well, I was going to say, it makes it easier, if you say something God doesn't agree with, for him to just zap you.
Yeah, literally might get zapped out of my studio.
Right.
But yes, the storm has passed, I guess, in more ways than one.
Very
so
good.
Next episode, we're going to explore a new quality of a deep disciple. We have 2 more to go. And then I think in 2 weeks, Lord willing, we'll have both Tim and Kyle back on video and audio. We'll see if we can get Tim back in here. Should be a great time greenhousing those two. So lots ahead still in season 4. It's a big season. The Forgotten Kingdom is a big issue. It's part of our journey into discipleship, which is why we're spending so much time with it. But thanks, everybody, for listening and watching today. So appreciate you taking the time to be with us as we explore these things. It's an exploratory podcast. We're not smart enough to claim we know all the answers. We are dumb enough to ask questions and invite you to engage those questions with us. If you want more information on Soil and Roots, we are increasing the number of ways that you can engage with us. Certainly, you can go to our website at soilandroots.org. You can always email us at fish@soilandroots.org. We are on Facebook, and we're going to be spending a little bit more time there. We haven't done a very good job of that, but you can check out Soil and Roots podcast. And our fledgling YouTube channel has started. It's just at Soil and Roots, and we're doing some work there as well. So even over the next month or so, you're going to see some adaptations to Facebook and YouTube. And we're starting an Instagram account that, at least as of today, has nothing in it, so I wouldn't bother looking at that. And we're going to be announcing some new ways that we're going to be connecting with you here in the next few months. So, as always, deeply appreciate you. If you love what you hear, if it's stimulating good conversation, if you're interested in forming your own greenhouse, reach out to us at fishandsoilandroots.org. And if you're interested in financially supporting us, we are completely supported by you. We are a Christian nonprofit organization funded by donations. You can give safely and securely at soilandroots.org. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.